God has a hard-on.
Perfect world was a dream. Primitive cerebral.
He's a traitor! He's a sadist!
You're all going to die down here.
The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
This is the AM Bite interview, and we definitely have a special show. So special that won't even be one of my famous pre-recorded introductions. We're going to get right at it, and that is because this is a special Halloween edition, and also because to prepare ourselves also for the horror of the holiday season, which is coming nigh. So for this special show, we have Scott Smith and his wife, Sandra Wells. As some of you know, we've had Scott on before to talk about his provocative book, God Reconsidered, Searching for Truth in the Battle Between Atheism and Religion. In his book, he argues for what he calls Shamanistic Gnosticism, and you can check out the free chapter as well as much more at his website, godreconsidered.com. Scott also has a book called The Soul of Your Pet, Evidence for the Survival of Animals After Death, which we'll discuss as well, and also his years reporting on the supernatural for Fate and UFO magazine. That's quite a bit, and probably even better, and I'm sure Scott will agree, is we'll talk with Sandra, who is a practitioner of real magic as opposed to the New Age version of Wicca, by how she dismisses as those without any ability to access the other world. So, how are you guys doing tonight?
We're doing great.
All ready to rock and roll into the other world.
There you go. I like that spirit. So why don't we start with Sandra? Tell us about how you came to be involved in magic.
Well, I had a rather unsupportive childhood, so much so that I was seeking for answers, of course, in books, thinking there's got to be a way out of this. There must be more to life than what I have been exposed to. And I was very, very curious. So immediately, I started working with all my knowledge and books and became first a Playboy bunny of all things in New York City. And then as a teenager, a jewelry designer, thinking happiness would be living on Park Avenue, which of course it was not. And all my relationships were failures. Everything was really not good. It looked good on the surface, but it really wasn't. And I refused to become a trophy wife. That would have been easy for me, but I really, really wanted to know what there was to know. And I had my first near-death experience, and I was very intuitive to begin with, but this really made me super intuitive. And now I really wanted answers from the other world. I no longer was interested in the other. So I wanted answers from magic, and I moved to California, and I met a lot of famous people. And through them, I got to meet authors of books on magic. By this time, I already had a very nice, big library. And everybody I met was all talk. There was really no substance there, just words. They were just wordsmiths. Nothing mattered. And I thought, well, I'll never get to meet anybody really in this lifetime. It just seemed against all odds that I'd meet somebody with true talent. Well, I really didn't think that I'd ever meet anybody. And then I did meet this rather hippie-looking gentleman who had a library similar to mine, and he said that he practiced. So, as usual, I made an appointment, and this was October of 1973. I met Scott, and this happened, the appointment was Christmas Eve of 73. And he came over, and I was so sure it was going to be nothing whatsoever that I had a party I was going to later that evening, and I made arrangements to meet a friend there, a big producers party, whatever. And this gentleman showed up, and, he asked me to get a few things, which I did. I'd gotten some candles and flowers, and I made some tea, which I made myself. And he came with his little equipment box, and I lived in this townhouse with two big windows and a door. And he said to me, have you ever been in a magic circle? And I said, no, I've never have. And he said, well, one thing I want to ask. He said that no matter what happens, do not leave this circle. No matter what happens. And I said, okay, I will not leave the circle. So we started. And I have never in my life, I never forget how it felt. He started with his incantations, and the energy was so unbelievably powerful that I didn't know how any human being could survive. It was like the event that was going on was so much that my hair stood on ends and I couldn't even bear it. It was so scary. It was the most frightening thing one could ever imagine. The room turned upside down. I thought this man was the devil. I didn't know what to think. I was really ready to kill myself. It was so unbelievably frightening.
Wow.
And it was just like, imagine Rosemary's Baby 10 times more. It was like the scariest thing that ever happened, ever, ever, ever. And it seemed like it went on forever. It seemed like, I don't know, I lost kind of consciousness a little bit. And I remember thinking, oh my God, this is real. This is, beware, what you asked for. This is real. And finally, he said, begone. And as he said this, I'm still in this magic circle. The windows, the two big windows in the door flew open. And I'm sitting there. And I'm afraid to look in. I wouldn't even look up. I thought I invited the devil into my life. I swear I did. I wouldn't even look at him. But I meekly asked, can I leave the circle to close the windows and the door? And he said yes. And I timidly did that. Wouldn't look at him. Kept my head down. I said, I never want to see this man again as long as I live. Oh my God, what did I do? Well, I crept up to bed that night, and the next morning, the pain that I had been experiencing with this relationship that as usual, didn't work out at that time, was gone. I figured, wow, this feels fabulous. Who knew, And I was like amazed, and I still thought at this point I would never see this man again. Well, 3 months later or so, I somehow got it together. I figured, I think I could do this again. And for the next couple of years, 5 or 6 or 7 years, we did 8 or 9 real operations. And he worked with Green Tara, who is a deity from Tibet. That was his choice, and a very powerful, powerful presence. And I was his vessel. I became a real vessel. And he trained me over the years. He trained me somewhat, and I did to the best of my ability. He was born with this natural ability, and I had to really work very, very hard to do anything, to even be working with him at all. And this went on for some time. We parted for a short period of time. Then when my father had gotten very sick in intensive care, I called him back from Michigan to come and work with me. And he did. And we got him out of intensive care. He lived for 5 more years, as he predicted. And he said, you've got to be really serious about this. Well, it was getting so that it was just, very, 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 very much work, and a lot of tension went on because there was so much work to do. Finally, he did pass. And after he did, I continued. I became a hypnotherapist, and I continued with my own meditation, my own way of working with things. And when I fell and smashed my leg to ribbons, the doctor's prognosis was not good. I spent 1 year and 3 months doing 4 to 6 hours a day of medical imagery. And when they took the scan and the CAT scan, they only could find, of course, the 5 pins. But I run now. I do everything because I spent the time. You can reinvent, if you really work at it. It took a lot of work, 1 year and 3 months to do that. But now at this point, things are fabulous. I met Scott about the same time that I met this Joe. We've been together. We've been to 32 countries in 17 years. And all of our trips have some kind of magical element to it. We bring forth all kinds of wonderful stuff. I really feel I've turned like a lemon life into a lemonade life because things have turned out so well for me. I can't believe my luck. And I do think it's been the most fabulous journey ever because of it. I think it was the most positive, fabulous journey one could ever have, and I'm very grateful to have had it. And that's about it right now.
Before we get to you, Scott, a quick question to you, Sandra. I'm sure you could go on and on. I mean, the spiritual journey is very long. It's a long evolution. What advice do you have for people who want to talk to spirits or who want to look into the other world? What advice, something quick you tell them?
Quick thing, they first have to get into the alpha state, which means really quieting the body first, when the body is kind of like not even there, and the mind becomes sharp and clear, like a little blue light will go off right between your eyes, and that is the alpha state where you can change anything, but you have to be in that place to be able to work things and do things and access things. So it's very, very hard work unless you practice it all the time and work very hard at it, because everyone's in chaos. And I think that if they wanted to really, they never ever have to ever stop being curious. To have an insatiable appetite is the name of the game for everything that's fabulous, real in this life and everything out there. It's all there, ours for the picking if you want to work at it. That's all I can say right now about that. It's been a fabulous trip. As I say, I'm very grateful, and I really feel that the best is yet to come.
Wonderful, wonderful. We certainly hope so. So why don't we go to you, Scott? Do you have any spiritual practices that have enabled you to access that other world?
Well, I would say this. I really had my first spiritual experience at 17. I grew up Mormon, as I mentioned in our prior interviews, and the Mormons are a great living religion. As Sandra found out, she went to a couple of funerals, and because she's psychically sensitive, she was really shocked at what the Mormons would call the power of the spirit. This is not a dead religion, and the Mormons will constantly talk about their encounters with spirits. Of course, the fundamentalists think this is all stuff from the devil. The demons are coming to visit you guys, pretending like they're your ancestors to help you with your genealogy and all that. But I grew up in a culture that was very accepting of the idea of interacting with the other world, and the Mormons have temple ceremonies, which are secret. They're sacred, and not you have to qualify to get in. But any kind of ritual, like the Gnostic Mass or even the Catholic Mass, Buddhist prayers, and doing, all kinds of mantras and colored sand paintings for ritual purposes and so forth. I believe any kind of ritual effort can start to connect you with the other world, and you do have to work at it, as some people have natural talent to work on. I today have an altar, a prayer altar, and I list all those I've ever known, my mentors, who I believe are in contact with me, and I do meditation every day, a mantra meditation. And I think that the more you do it, it's been my experience that you tend to attract synchronicities and all kinds of odd miracles. As Sandra mentioned, we have a lot of these odd things happen as we travel and stuff. But anybody can have access to this stuff. I will also say that in my experience with direct knowledge with Gnosis, which happened to be in January '89, kind of unbidden, quite frankly. So if you swim around in the supernatural pool long enough, strange things will happen to you. But this was followed 5 months later by an experience with ayahuasca. And Graham Hancock, in his book Supernatural, has a very interesting discussion about shamanism in South America and why it's not just hallucination when the shamans have these kind of experiences with ayahuasca. It's a very interesting logical examination of why this is not simply something to be dismissed. But prayer of any kind, I think, does help attract the spirits that wish you well. And I think if you just concentrate on any discipline and kind of stick with it, eventually the fruits start to be known. In my life, I've had a lot of very, very strange things happen, not ghosts appearing to me, but things that were way, way beyond coincidence, when I was working on stories and stuff like that. And it's even today in my worldly work as a business columnist, I have the strangest stuff happen. So swim in the supernatural ocean as a starting point, I would say.
Scott, you mentioned to me that when Sandra and you do international travel stories, magical synchronicities happen. Could you give us an example?
Okay, well, one thing to know is this. Number one is we think that Americans are dangerously isolated in that ivory tower known as Fortress America. And it's not good for our business, our politics, and our cultural awareness. So we've made a point. We do a travel article a year as media, and we go to a lot of unusual places. I mean, our first trip together was to Ireland, and I had written about people in Ireland who met fairies and some very credible experiences. She met one of the people. These were people who didn't drink, who lived normal lives, and they all had very consistent anecdotes about encountering the fairies. And from that point on, every trip had something strange happen. We went to a Santeria ceremony in our honor in Cuba in 1998. We met a pagan leader in Egypt worshiping the old gods, and we went to some temples where Sandra could feel the spiritual energy. We went to the Oracle of Delphi, and the tour guide, who was herself psychic, came up to Sandra and said, "I can see you're one of those who understand why the Oracle was located here." And Sandra had not said anything to her. We went in India, we went to Sarnath, where Buddha gave his first preaching, and I talked to the monks there. We were invited into a Jain temple ceremony, and we've been to Saudi Arabia, of all things, in Riyadh, which was a fantastic experience, really, with Islam. And we the whirling dervishes in Egypt. Yes, that was an amazing experience. We looked around, and the 200 Japanese tourists were all in a trance because of the energy. And those whirling dervishes in Cairo were like no other that we've ever experienced. And we've been to their ceremonies a number of times. Shinto temples in Japan. We've always been on this pilgrimage to find the truth. And one of the oddest things, I mentioned that we think Americans should travel. So we got invited to South Africa under some unusual circumstances. We didn't have any idea. We had to pay for part of it because it was a very expensive. I mean, the hotels were like $3,000 a night. We didn't have to pay for that, but the airline wasn't willing to take us there free and back. So we had to kind of chip in, and we didn't know where we were going to get the money. And out of the blue, just the right amount of money came through for that. And one other thing, it happened to be perfect timing with another strange event that no reporter ever gets invited to in Washington, D.C. Everything worked out. Then we were afraid that we would not see the animals because we only had 48 hours, and we thought, this is not like a zoo. We've talked to people who have been to South Africa for a week and didn't see anything. As it happened, the gods arranged for everything to pretty much happen within like a half a day. Every possible animal in South Africa, from a rhinoceros that almost charged us to a leopard that came about 3 feet away from me. I mean, we were like magnets for these animals. And the tour guides who'd been there for years said, "We've never seen anything like this," But there were a number of reasons behind this. The South Africans have an incredible way of bringing up children that Americans could learn from, and how they instill self-confidence. And we learned about climate change, because that's really the story. South Africa can be argued is the original Garden of Eden. The first art was there. Many of the earliest human-like beings were there. And we came back with a message that the reason the Neanderthals and all our cousins didn't survive is they didn't adapt to climate change. So, every time we go out into the world, we come back with some important message about, living better, essentially. And there's usually a spiritual thing central to that as well.
You wrote for Fate, Scott, in the 2000s. Did you meet any genuine psychics?
Yeah, it actually started in 1990 with a very weird experience. I had been reading Scott Rogo's books. He wrote 30 books, the greatest parapsychologist ever in terms of his ability to show why the skeptics are wrong about supernatural stuff. And on Father's Day, I went with my ex-wife and my son, who became very important in my career with Gnosticism later, helping me write God Reconsidered. And we went to do an interview with him for Fate. And we covered the whole gamut. He was a fascinating guy because he wasn't just an academic. He had trained himself to leave his body. He was telling me he was in New York one time at a conference, and he wanted to check up on his roommate, and he astral projected back there and noticed that he had invited a friend over to the house, which I guess he wasn't supposed to do. And so he came back and said, "Hey, I know you had a friend over." They were really an amazing guy, and he was a very hard-nosed in his attitudes about everything. And his first book was called Phone Calls from the Dead, in which he documented that people apparently received calls from their loved one after they died, all kinds of weird stuff. So that was the starting of my career, and he was murdered a few weeks after I interviewed him. He virtually never, ever gave an interview. This was like the only really thorough interview he had given to a general interest publication. So that kind of started my career. And then to some extent, I went around with Sandra, who I knew at the time, and I started visiting, interviewing a lot of psychics. James Van Praagh was one of them. I got to know Laurie Campbell, who was part of the afterlife experiments. And what was fascinating about it is she did a very, very accurate reading on me as I looked back a year later. But then the next time I went back to her, she was completely off. And Scott Rocco had told me psychic ability is like a bad electrical connection. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So when the skeptics say, "Oh, look, the guy was wrong," they don't seem to understand that it's not like, an automatic thing and somebody's on all the time. We got to know Uri Geller quite well, and he was I had decided to prep from the skeptic's point of view. I read James Randi's view on him. He wrote a book on him, and so I was all prepared to show that he was a fraud. And first of all, I went in another room to draw a little symbol, and then I had him guess it in a way that there was no way he could know what I did, and he guessed that. And then Sandra was present when he was standing about 100 feet away, and we both had a key. Fortunately, it wasn't the key to our apartment, but it bent over. Because Randy was always saying, "Oh, what he does is he touches it with a little chemical on his finger, and that's what causes it to bend." Peter Hurkos, one of the greatest psychics and underrated and kind of forgotten. And he actually worked for the CIA, and a number of stories Sandra could tell you about that. I started doing a book on Bevy Jagers and went to Chicago to interview, or St. Louis to interview a whole bunch of the police she worked with. She helped on about 50 murders. So I went off on this incredible adventure of interviewing. There's that film and book, Meetings with Remarkable Men. That was kind of the story of my life in the 1990s and 2000s. And one of the most interesting guys I ever met was Thomas Males, who wrote a number of books on which Dances with Wolves was based. He was a leading American Indian authority. And one of the interesting things about him was he was an atheist in teaching architecture at Berkeley. And one night he opened up his eyes and the whole room was lighted up, and there was a monk standing at the end of his bed. This was a little bit of a surprise for an atheist. And he said, "Thomas, you are going to serve God no matter what." And then the monk disappeared. So Males ended up becoming I think a Methodist minister. And then he retired, became an authority on American Indians. He wrote a book about, I think it was Black Elk, his biography, and he told us some astounding stories about Native American miracles that he witnessed. So, it was a wild ride, and I imagine some of these things are online now, but I met enough of these people that either genuinely read my mind or did, impressive feats that I know it's not just trickery. And the skeptics are really just afraid to look into it too deeply because that will shake their understanding of the world.
And another thing that they definitely go after is UFOs. Scott, you wrote for UFO magazine, and you have a chapter about that in your book, God Reconsidered. And you also deal with the skeptic and the atheist arguments on it. But I guess the question would be, what do UFOs have to do with belief in God? I mean, the aliens might be atheists too.
Yes, and the funny thing is, and this is my argument in God Reconsidered, the first 3 chapters are about ESP, the evidence for afterlife, and UFOs. Well, the problem with modern atheism is that it's so wrapped up in trying to debunk the supernatural in general, they've forgotten that there's a difference between disbelief in God and materialism. Materialism insists that the whole world is what we can see and feel. It's the material world, atoms and all this stuff. And they intuitively realize that if you start believing in this wacky supernatural stuff, it's a slippery slope to belief in God. So you can't prove there's a God to somebody who is not willing to open themselves up to a mystical experience. So it's the wrong question to ask people, do you believe in this logical evidence about first movers and stuff like that? So I started from a different point, and I said, let's debate whether there's compelling evidence for supernatural invention. So dimension. And I examined several cases in my book of UFOs. Now, they could obviously just be flying saucers driven by aliens from another planet. But the skeptics insist that they can't be that either. Even a materialist explanation won't work for them. They're petrified of looking at these things. Now, the absolutely fascinating thing about this is that when you look, they have a few people who specialized in debunking UFOs. And when you read their books, and then you go back to the original sources, as I did, you find that it's absolutely incredible how often they have to lie and distort the evidence. They'll say such and such a thing happened, and then you go back and you realize they left out a few crucial points, like that the UFOs were picked up by radar, by pilots who were experienced at observing things in the air and aircraft and so forth, and that there were many witnesses. Just to give you an example, in the Hudson Valley of New York from 1982 to 1986, there were thousands of people there were mass sightings, sometimes as many as 1,000 people at a time, of these massive, long, dark, metallic, boomerang-shaped craft, about 200 feet long, and they came down very low. One was like 20 feet above the ground, and this stuff was seen by many people, including a lot of police. The media kind of ignored it. The FAA showed zero interest in it, which is kind of suspicious unto itself. There were all kinds of mundane explanations given for it that don't work. They say, oh, they were blimps. Well, then how do you explain the fast way that they took off? So what I would say to skeptics is this: you can be an agnostic, you can be an atheist, but if you are open-minded and not afraid, look into the claims for UFOs and other supposedly supernatural thing, and then we can have another discussion about, whether this is a stranger world than the materialists want to tell us it is.
And what about this idea, Scott and Sandra? Feel free to weigh in as well. And this is something that's brought up in the movie Interstellar. It was brought up at the Gnostic Countercultures Conference by the scholarship of Jeff Kripal, that these aliens could be just our future selves talking back to us. Have you guys given that any thought?
I will say this. There is enough hard evidence that something real, not just our future selves. I'm a skeptic about that. Let's put it that way. However, I will say this. If you really want to be spooked and realize it's not just your future selves coming back, Read C.D.B. Bryan's Close Encounters of the Fourth Kind. He was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. I interviewed him, and he got out of studying the abduction business for the same reason I did, because you begin to question your sanity. I share David Jacobs, who I think is a Harvard professor who's written a bunch of books on this, Secret Life and the Threat, in which he argues that these aliens, if that's what they are definitely kind of demonic and hostile. And Jacques Vallée, who used to work for the government UFO debunking program, ironically enough, wrote Dimensions and some other books where he makes a very compelling argument that this is a supernatural phenomenon. It looks like alien craft because that's what they want us to believe, but if you look really, really closely, UFOs have been involved with a lot of religious phenomena, including the apparitions of the Virgin Mary. Scott Rogo did a whole book called Miracles, where he shows that entities of some sort are attempting to manipulate human consciousness. I think that's probably what it has to do. And other fancy theories I'm much more skeptical about. But I frankly don't recommend that people delve into this too much. It can be pretty scary stuff. The reason I talked about this in the book is I wanted to show the skeptics that even if you just assume that they're alien craft, there's very, very compelling evidence that something's going on. It needs to be investigated. Why are we afraid to investigate it?
And it should be mentioned before we go to our next question that Scott is looking for a debate, a friendly debate with somebody who would like to challenge any of his views or points in the book, whether you're a skeptic, atheist, or one of the other religions that he talks about in his book. So for any of you listeners who know somebody, we're looking. And again, it would be a friendly debate over here at AM by Gnostic Radio. So moving on, what kind of credible evidence is there for an afterlife?
Well, if UFOs weren't wacky enough, I thought, the skeptics are going to say, afterlife, what could possibly be evidence? And again, the amusing thing is that the skeptics can't help themselves. If you read their magazines, which I do, you find them dismissing these things by saying something like, near-death experiences, those are just brain hallucinations, chemicals from the dying brain, or, some of the drugs they're giving the patient, and, they knew all about the procedure when they woke up. They described it because they were listening to the doctors, and your brain can still hear, blah, 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 blah. The problem is, again, these explanations fall apart. If you look at this very carefully, and I go through, I breeze through some of the evidence in my book, the biological pharmaceutical factors that supposedly produce near-death experiences and stuff, actually it doesn't add up. It can't work for technical reasons, scientific reasons that I go into. And one interesting thing is the visitors often end up with visions that don't have anything to do with their religious background. It could be things that they didn't even imagine. And also, a lot of times when people leave their bodies, they will go into other parts of the hospital, report things that were going on which they couldn't possibly have known about. They can report conversations between people who were far away. So just on that mundane level. Now, I mentioned Scott Rogo was able to leave his body. There's quite a bit of evidence, actually laboratory evidence, which was conducted at SRI in Stanford, where they did a lot of very careful controlled experiments, and it showed that people could leave their body, go into another room, look at a set of cards, and come back and, report what happened there. Now, if you believe in ESP, which the skeptics don't, you might say, well, that's like a remote viewing thing. But a materialist point of view simply doesn't work. There's a great book by a guy named Schmicker called Best Evidence, where he goes into discussing the evidence for ghosts. And again, you might think, wow, that's a passing phenomenon. Some people say they see them. There are actually quite a number of very convincing multiple witness, things being moved around the room. And all anybody has to do is just scratch the surface, and they will find there's quite a bit of evidence. There were also some careful university studies called the afterlife experiments. It's really fascinating because they took some of the best known psychic mediums like Alison Dubois, who was the inspiration for Medium on TV, John Edward, I met him, Laurie Campbell, I had my reading from her and some others. And they took these mediums and tried to see if they could make contact with the other world and then check what they said the messages were and go back. And they had a pretty compelling argument. George Anderson, one of the other guys that was involved, wrote a book called We Don't Die. I saw him work on 60 Minutes once. Very, very compelling stuff. And I did a very close study of James Van Praagh, and I didn't really have an opinion about him, but I found most of what he said was remarkably accurate. Finally, if we could go on to Soul of Your Pet, which is kind of related here, the evidence that some higher animals, and I don't know how far down the chain that goes, hopefully not cockroaches into the next world, but at least dogs, cats, birds, and horses and so forth. In my book, The Soul of Your Pet, I report a lot of interesting anecdotes from people who normally don't have any kind of psychic experience. They don't see ghosts. They don't, get psychic impressions and talk to the dead and all this kind of stuff. A lot of the people that I quote were veterinarians, doctors, psychologists. Many of them told me they weren't religious. They never had an experience outside of the one they related to me. If they did have an experience where they saw a deceased animal, their religion said that animals don't have spirits, so they weren't really prepared for these things. And, a lot of the skeptics will say, oh, well, they saw their dead pets and they just were, it was wish projection. No. In many cases, they weren't the owner of the pet. They didn't even know that the animal was supposedly dead. Like they would watch the dog running around in the backyard. They'd say something to the neighbor the next day, and the neighbor would say, oh, I'm sorry to tell you, but yeah, our dog died a few days ago. So there were all these weird multiple witness things, and even pets reacting to ghost animals. So it wasn't just human imagination. So whether you take deathbed visions and you look at the biochemistry, or whether you use psychic mediums and test what they have to say, hauntings, reports about ghost animals and so forth, there's an amazing amount of compelling evidence that humans and higher animals survive. What happens after that? I don't think anybody knows, which is why there's so many different contradictions among religions.
In your book, Scott, you say you're skeptical about reincarnation. What do you say to those who claim to have past life memories?
Well, Scott Rogo comes to the rescue again. First of all, he wrote a book called The Search for Yesterday, and it's not the only book like this, but I think it's the best one, and I mentioned some others in my chapters on this subject. Gnostics, incidentally, are perfectly free to believe in reincarnation, and I think the Cathars and the Manichaeans did. Probably majority of the Gnostics I know do. Bishop Stefan Heller is a little more skeptical, at least of the New Age variety, this notion that you're born into this life to learn some lessons, and then, if you don't achieve enlightenment in this life, then you get this fabulous chance to come back and learn another set of lessons. And then eventually, you graduate to the other world and you don't have to come back. Now, there are lots of problems with this. And if somebody wants to believe in reincarnation, and probably I'm guessing a majority of your listeners might, that's fine. But my book, as it says in the subtitle, is about searching for truth, not playing nice and saying, every path is the same and there's no contradictions between religion and all that kind of stuff. I'm interested in really what is true. And when you take a very careful look at reincarnation, it's not likely to be true and certainly not karma. The great Nag Hammadi translator and Gnostic Gilles Quispel told Heller once that reincarnation might happen because people are drawn back into this world for some reason, an attachment, which would kind of fit the Buddhist idea. But he said karma, no. Karma just doesn't really work. And here's why. First of all, people have a very simplistic idea about what happens in their lives. Because we can each have prayers answered and have a guardian angel, and we're looking through the narrow lens of our life, we think we're in control, we have free will, specific things happen to us. The problem with karma is that it loads you up for certain things that you're supposed to pay off in the next life. And that means, just to give an example, let's say you were in a car and you were drunk and you ran over a child. So in the next life, you're going to get run over as a child, just to take a simplistic example, by a drunk driver. Well, what this means is, first of all, you have to be born into a culture and time where there are cars, and you can't be born in rural Kenya if your parents can't afford a car, just to give you a hypothetical here. And then you can't, die as an infant. If you're supposed to pay off your karma at age 10, you got to, be protected from wars and diseases and, accidents and so forth until that time, which sounds great if the entire universe revolves around you. The problem is all these other people around you have their karma. And, I find it kind of amusing that, everybody is born into this purposeful life, even though if you look at history and prehistory, there have been about 70 billion people, and most of them were born in the Dark Ages. There was a 50% infant mortality rate until about a couple of centuries ago. And everybody seems to have been born in the first world that believes in reincarnation. The problem is free will, if it exists, and I think the evidence is it's very limited, comes into conflict with all the other free will and all the other karma. There are just so many problems. And I'll give you another example here. There are 250,000 people died from the tsunami some years ago in Southeast Asia. So you would have to say, well, all those 250,000 people had to die right at the same time, just like all those Japanese had to die from the 2 atomic bombs, 250,000 or whatever it was. And because they all had the identical karma, and that was their time to go and so forth. Again, it only works if the entire universe revolves around you and nobody else has free will, and it's so important that you, fulfill your karma and stuff. The funny thing is that nobody in India, and Sandra and I have been there and talked to people, and we're very familiar with Hinduism. Nobody there says that after all these millennia of reincarnation, that people are more spiritual today there than they were, say, 5,000 years ago. That's why they read the Vedas back in the spiritual time. The masters were then. And so it doesn't work with that notion that, you're coming back to live your lives. This is like a very new agey American kind of thing. Furthermore, the Buddhists aren't supposed to believe in a soul. I mean, Ken Wilber, who's probably one, if not the leading American scholar on Eastern religions, said very clearly, he said, Buddha said, there is no soul that survives death. It is simply magnetized karma, essentially, no personality, no memory, okay? Now, popular Mahayana Buddhism, which, occurred about 600 years or 500 years after the Buddha, you know, that kind of thing that believes in gods and, you know, you're supposed to, you know, pray to Amitabha and all this kind of stuff, you know, it's really a contradiction. Furthermore, if you don't have a soul, then, you know, why bother doing all these spiritual practices? You know, certain radical elements of Buddhism will say, you know, there's not even a difference between enlightenment and ignorance. They will say everything's an illusion, you know. So you can go down that hall of mirrors, and a lot of American Buddhists think that, you know, there's reincarnation. Not according, you can say the Tibetan Buddhists say the lamas can reincarnate, but, you know, there is no evidence for reincarnation. Scott Rogo shows that all these so-called memories actually can be explained in very mundane ways and have been, and people claim to have memories, then they find out the person's still alive, or the memories actually are from two dead people. It really doesn't work well, and it doesn't take into fact that people barely even survived until about a century ago when we had antibiotics and so forth. So this kind of idealistic idea of our purpose in life is really an attempt to glorify this life. Gnosticism says, you know something, the creation was a mistake, whether you think it's an accident or by you know, an evil entity or whatever. This is not a good test, and I think that people who read my chapter on whether the Creator is benevolent and sent us here to learn lessons are going to be very, very disillusioned. People don't want to hear this. So that's the essence of my argument, and if people want to believe in reincarnation, you know, it's not central to... the only thing I can assert is that we survive death. That I'm very certain about.
And it should be noted, and this is something that the Gnostics and probably some of the more hardcore or original Buddhists, is that, let's say reincarnation is true, it is not a good thing as people in the West think. It's something akin to hell. I mean, eternal forgetfulness completely goes against Gnosis, doesn't it?
Yeah, you know, this is another weird kind of contradiction, and I think that the notion of reincarnation has appeal superficially, but this doesn't. Honestly, there's something called homeostasis, which means that no matter what trauma you go through, you kind of return to normal in about 3 months. I mean, they've done studies of Holocaust camp survivors and, you know, people who lost family members in a horrible accident and stuff like that. We get over ecstasy too. You know, we get the new job, we win the lottery. 3 months later, on average, we're okay with it. The new car is nice, you know. And the same thing with disaster. Humans are very, very resilient. Now, I should also mention, you called my attention to this new magazine by Andrew Smith, the Gnostic Six, which I just bought on Amazon, and I have an article on there specifically about the evidence for life after death. I don't get into the reincarnation issue, so if anybody doesn't care about that argument of mine, this is the pure argument about the scientific evidence for deathbed visions and related stuff. And of course, I have the chapter in my book at God Reconsidered, and that's available on Nook and Amazon as an ebook.
Scott, you point out the significant flaws in theologies of mainstream religions, and at the end devote some chapters to Gnosticism. What do you say Gnosis is? How does it liberate? And what are the best arguments for it as a description of a metaphysical reality?
So, first of all, and Bishop Heller makes this point too, Gnosis, or that intuitive enlightenment about the true nature of the existential dilemma we're in and our true home in the hereafter, and the nature of God, essentially, can come, as it did for me in a flash in January 1989, over a period of a few hours. I wasn't really prepared for it. But also, it can be a very gradual awareness that can come from study, and I believe that it isn't really so much a lightning bolt as it is an insight into the nature of reality. You know, a lot of people will say, well, you know, Marcion and the Cathars and Gospel of Thomas and other things, you know, they don't really emphasize, you know, having this grand vision experience thing. I would say the most radical aspect of Gnosis and Gnosticism is to perceive the deep duality of the nature of reality. Once the blinders are taken off your eyes and you realize that all the other traditional religions which say, oh, the benevolent good God, Jehovah or Allah or whoever it is, you know, created this wonderful, wonderful world and put us here so that we could learn to exercise our free will. Once you realize that that is the biggest lie of all time, I mean, if there was ever a hell, this is it. And, you know, Americans are so isolated from reality. This is one thing about international travel. You get to see the real world. And Americans are unbelievably ignorant about history. I write a lot about historical figures for my column in Leaders in Success in Investors Business Daily. And, you know, it's a constant learning experience, but you know, the ignorance of wars and disease and the problems of the past, we don't realize how lucky we have it. We take everything for granted. And unless you become aware through a mystical experience or study, which is also very helpful, reading scriptures and other ways, you cannot see why this world is not a place for us to exercise free will. I've got a whole chapter questioning the concept of free will. And for sure, the God who created this world is not benevolent. Now, Gnostics acknowledge the higher God. But one of the things that convinced me about Gnosticism, aside from my direct knowledge, was the awareness that every single other religion perpetuates this propaganda that God is good and he created the world in, you know, 6 days or whatever and declared it good and all that. The world is not good. Now, that said, you don't have to have a negative point of view about life. You can enjoy life once you recognize that you're not going to hell, you're in hell. You're not going to be punished for those 10 commandments. You don't have to go to church and say mass every single day. You know, Jehovah's not up there, you know, ready to throw you into hell because you didn't join the right church and all this other stuff. You can relax. Gnostics can be very laid back. They realize that this world is a terrible joke, and that in and of itself is liberating. Once you realize that the Wizard of Oz is trying to pull these little strings to make you think that Jehovah is the God, then you're liberated in this life. And I believe that all people will have their initial liberation when they die because they're freed from the body. They go into the hereafter. Exactly what happens after that is speculated on by the seers, but we do survive, and apparently we get to see our loved ones. And I believe that the Gnostics were right, and all other spiritual leaders were right, that if you do good things in this world, and if you meditate and do spiritual practices and become loving and so forth, I think that helps you in the hereafter to the extent that we can make progress there. The Mormons would say there's eternal progress. Nothing is really limiting you but you. Once you survive death, you get a chance to embrace higher truths if you want. But the reality is your personality doesn't change. You know, it's no magic wand to die. You know, this is why when people contact spirits and they want to know the eternal truth, The spirits are as dumb as we are. I remember George Anderson, the medium, who's a believer in reincarnation, once asked the spirits. He wanted to get their first-hand thing. He says, is there reincarnation? And the spirits said, well, we've heard about it. Well, if you're dead and you don't know if there's reincarnation, I think that's a big question mark. But you do survive. That's the good news. That's the liberation. You can have liberation in this life, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. And I believe we can progress forever once we get out of our bodies. There's no need to come back. It was a bad idea the first time. If you're born again, you'll be born into a family with a whole new set of dysfunctions. So let's hope we all get liberated, but we don't need to be anxious to get there. And modern Gnostics certainly wouldn't say, hey, this is a terrible place, let's all commit mass suicide. Hey, this is a great world in many ways. You know, you can go out, have a lot of fun with your friends, see great movies, enjoy the life. Just don't take the religious aspects all that seriously.
And Scott, to end, here's a question I want to ask you, and I've definitely given my explanations for this question or issue, but I was curious to get your take on it as a modern Gnostic. What about the concept that, okay, so we are here trapped by malevolent or at the very best bureaucratic forces that are keeping us down? How does this excuse the higher God or the forces of light? How does that, I mean, the buck has to stop somewhere, right?
Right. Well, I think that's a very good point. And actually, I think it's a favor in Gnosticism because one thing we can say for sure, this reality is not overrun by good or evil. The demons have not brought about the apocalypse, and they're not inhabiting everybody. Something is holding them back. We know there are malevolent beings. Something is holding them back. Likewise, we can say the good guys haven't overrun the earth either. You know, we don't have our guardian angel appearing to us every day. What that argues is the Manichaean idea of tension between the forces of good and evil. And they would say there are many things we can do to kind of promote the good. So I would say that the Gnostic God is impersonal and removed from this kind of reality. Maybe he and some of his cohorts have a hard time coming into this reality because it's like an Ebola zone. It would contaminate them. And I think that the best we can do is to try to live right, get in contact with the spirits, spread the good word, and more will be revealed, as the prophets said, when we get out of this life. But to the extent we can learn the truth here, there are many, many, many mysteries. And one thing for sure, the demiurge is real. He invented this world, and it's in the image of the maker.
Yeah, he gave us the platypus. What else can I say about that? But, all right. First, before we go, everybody, again, Scott and AM by Gnostic Radio are looking for a debate with somebody who wants to challenge us or disagree some of Scott's points in the show or the book, which you can find at godreconsider.com. If you want a debate, we'll, of course, get you a copy of the book so you can do your homework. And, again, we can have a friendly debate. For those of you out there, don't forget to please support AM by Gnostic Radio in any way you can. There are ways at thegodabovegod.com, my homepage, or shoot me an email at miguel@thegodabovegod.com. Oh, by the way, Scott, if somebody wants to shoot you an email, what is it?
Yeah, it's probably the best one to do is Scott Stanley Smith 1950 at Gmail, and I'm on Facebook because I'm a fairly well-known business journalist and columnist. So just look up Scott Stanley Smith on Facebook. I'm also on LinkedIn. You know, I'm happy to engage with anybody. I've got you can post comments on my website. Nasty ones are fine. You know, I'm happy to get into dialogue on all this stuff. It helps us explore the truth. The more we can poke around and get into this stuff.
Agreed. Like you said, unless we make an effort, and like Sandra said, unless we make an effort, we're not going to discover new things and have the ability to calibrate and modify our thoughts and arguments and our own gnosis. So let's get it on, as they say. But thanks a lot, Scott, and thank you very much, Sandra, for coming on Aeon Byte, and we shall do this again.
Thank you. We appreciate it, Miguel.